how did this movement, how does this pair with all this talk about Reagan and Gorbachev that I was hearing about and that I was reading about? What influence did they have? Did they have any influence? Was the administration as all concerned about a million or so people marching through the streets of New York City with big banners saying, "Hell no, we won't glow"? I thought that was the greatest thing to see all these images of all this stuff.
Yeah.
And, it was stuff that again I didn't have any exposure to in my history courses. So I thought it was very fascinating. I really wanted to kind of like dig in more into this period and to look at that relationship again between protest and policy, if you will.
That was a deep dig you did.
Yeah, so I can just sort of start going on this stuff. I've been thinking about this topic and talking about this topic for so long now.
Wow.
And so, Henry, this is great. So I want you to tell us, a little bit more about the book and about Freeze,
Yeah.
because I'm reading your book now after skimming it, and it's a fascinating account of the nuclear freeze movement of the '80s, but it's also a great reflection of the national and international political interplay from the '50s to the '80s. So
Yeah.
just run through the book, and then we'll start hitting questions.
It's pretty hard to
Yeah.
run.
Okay. So if I can just sort of sum up this book briefly, like I was saying, I got interested in this late Cold War period, and so with this book, I really wanted to address some of the big question about what is the relationship between protest and policy. And I think I originally got interested in this topic. I was in grad school, and the Iraq War was going on, and we had participated in some of the anti-Iraq war stuff, and I was interested in, do these movements have any kind of influence on foreign policy? And being a part of that Iraq War movement, it felt like we were just sort of shut off immediately in the aftermath of all that. So I was wondering about the Vietnam anti-war movement, and digging through some of that, I kind of learned that yes, there was some influence on domestic politics with the Vietnam anti-war movement. And kind of going down deeper into these rabbit holes of peace activism and foreign policy, I started developing an interest in kind of Cold War history and learning about the anti-nuclear movement. That again, like stuff that I wasn't being taught in school, and that was stuff that really kind of I took a fascinating view with. I was really fascinated by all of this. And so, with regard to the book, with regard to Freeze, I start out in my introduction. I do try to kind of backtell and kind of show that there has been a larger, going from post-World War II up through, say, like the early 1980s. There had been prior, anti-nuclear movements. There was the test ban campaign, and the test ban campaign has some efficiency, you can say. They do manage to eventually get a test ban. I think it's a good deal of it has to do with the pressures that they put on the Kennedy administration and the pressures that came through domestic politics. And eventually we do get a test ban treaty. Now it's a flawed test ban treaty, right? Because they still have this kind of loophole that allows you to test nuclear weapons underground. Mm-hmm. But it's a treaty, and it effectively did put a stop to testing above ground nuclear weapons. Now from there, I worked and talked a little bit about the anti-war movement of Vietnam, and that's kind of where the peace activism kind of shifts. We go from, the test ban treaty is in 1963. The peace activism kind of shifts from there into the Vietnam War era. So we're kind of seeing a blend of peace activism and civil rights activism in that 1960s into the early 1970s. And again, I tried to show in the introduction, how does this affect policy? How did these protests work to kind of pressure Johnson, to pressure Nixon? And I think, again, I show in the book some examples of how this peace activism did influence Johnson and Nixon. And in particular, I use some of the Nixon tapes to kind of give you some kind of very juicy quotes from Nixon and Kissinger about how they're going to use arms control as a way of trying to appease some of the unrest at home. Yeah, how can they criticize their president if he's abroad making all these grand deals? So I try to show again there, even through the process of what Cold War historians call détente, the lessening of tensions. Even there, Nixon and Kissinger are using that as a way to kind of co-opt that peace movement. Then we get to the end of the Vietnam War, and it kind of seems like, to an extent, if you kind of look out there, the peace activism seems to be kind of like faded out, right? Like there doesn't seem to be the strong element of peace activism. But what I try to show is that there really is still a kind of stronger movement that's going on in the grassroots. It might not be the same size as, say, the anti-war movement of the Vietnam era, but they are targeting specific weapons systems, right? Like the B-1 bomber. There's a large campaign against the B-1 bomber to try to almost, because you can find with the B-1 bomber was a great example. You could find different weapons manufacturers in almost every state. And so you could start a campaign there, local campaigns in different states, targeting, say, like General Electric, if you will, or targeting any of these other large arms manufacturers. So I talk about the B-1 bomber. I go into some depth about the MX missile controversy as well. That's coming under the Jimmy Carter administration. The MX was a 10 warhead ICBM, a massive missile. It was causing all kinds of controversy. They wanted to base it in Nevada and Utah, and a large coalition forms up against that. But you also find, up in the Northeast, there was a movement to stop the Trident missile being based up in Connecticut. So I tried to show there's all these various different movements, different campaigns against nuclear weapons, but there wasn't one unifying ideology until Randy Forsberg comes along in 1979. And that's kind of where the story starts to pick up. Randy Forsberg was this, you can think of her as I like to think of her as what she calls herself, a different kind of arms control advocate. And she's not so much interested in arms control as she is in kind of stopping the arms race. She wants to kind of go beyond just controlling nuclear weapons to eventually finding a way to get rid of all these things. And so she's working as a typist out in Switzerland, actually. And from there, she's typing all these documents up about nuclear weapons and coming to this conclusion that neither side is really interested in stopping this arms race. And she's going to different peace organizations, and she's meeting with them, and she's giving talks. And one of the ideas that keeps circulating was this idea that we should have unilateral disarmament. Because again, this is the wake of the Vietnam War. There's a lot of the United States is the supreme aggressor on the world stage. If we want to have peace in the world, we've got to have unilateral disarmament. The United States needs to kind of unilaterally cut its nuclear weapons back down to size. Well, Randy Forsberg takes that idea and says, well, hey, if you want to go mainstream with this idea, you can't go and advocate for unilateral disarmament because that's not going to be a mainstream idea. But if you took that concept and you made it bilateral, you said both the United States and the Soviet Union need to cut their arsenals. We need to have a freeze, as Forsberg would later call it, freeze on the production of nuclear weapons, freeze on the testing of nuclear weapons, freeze on the development, the testing, the deployment of nuclear weapons. People can understand that. People can grasp their heads around a freeze, because then you're also circumventing some of this kind of nuclear language, as you will, like the language of the nuclear priesthood, where you get into things like arms control talks, SALT, START, MERV, ABM treaties, throwaways. This is stuff that people can kind of, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around, like a throw weight and what's the range of this missile. But if you say freeze, that we want to just freeze the arms race, people can grasp that. People can kind of understand what that is. And so
I think it really responded to people's feeling at the time that there was this escalation that just had its own momentum and they had no control over it.
Yeah.
And that was one word to really try to just stop it dead in its tracks.
Yeah, and I think it's by and large, it's also there's also kind of like a parallel track happening among like the American political institutions and the Cold War that I get into this in the book too a little bit. The escalation of the arms race post Vietnam, where again we are seeing this desire that the American right is kind of emerging, and they're saying things like we're behind in the arms race, right? The Soviet Union has built up its ICBMs since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we have fallen behind in this arms race, and we've got to catch up. We've got to modernize, was the word that these the neocons like to use back then. We've got to modernize our nuclear weapons. We've got to have newer ICBMs. This is, again, where the INF, the Euro missiles, came into play. The Soviets had developed the SS-20, the medium-range, intermediate-range nuclear weapon. And we didn't have a weapon. And so this is the logic of the arms race. This is the logic of military Keynesianism, right? If they don't have a weapon, if we don't have a weapon and they do, well, then by golly, we've got to build up that weapon too. So we would then go into, we didn't have this weapon, right? But we're going to build this INF weapon, the Euro missiles, the Pershing IIs, and we'll put them in Europe. And that will be our counter to the SS-20s. And, of course, this thing is being developed in the late 70s, and it's scheduled to be deployed by 1983. And when you're doing this, you're also causing, again, you're kind of picking up the anti-war movement, the anti-nuclear movement in Europe is kind of, blowing up at the scenes at this point in time about putting missiles in their backyard, essentially making them the targets of a nuclear attack, putting them on the front lines. So that's emerging in Europe at the same time as Randy Forsberg is also talking to some of these different organizations. You also have this, as you were saying, this kind of a escalation of the arms race, this escalation of the Cold War. And that's stuff that's starting under Jimmy Carter, right? Like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and all the consequences that come from that. We're going to have a SALT II treaty under Jimmy Carter, but it never actually gets ratified. And there's a lot of kind of loopholes in the SALT II treaty. It's not a great treaty. There are a lot of flaws with that treaty, but it was a step towards, do something about the arms race that really seems out of control by the time Reagan is taking office in 1980.